On October 1, 1854, outside the port city of Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula, 50,000 British-French coalition troops had encircled the city, their military momentum directly threatening its defenses. 10 days earlier, in the Battle of the Alma River, the coalition, leveraging dual advantages in weaponry and firepower, had inflicted heavy damage on the main Russian forces. From a military standpoint, this crucial port city on the Black Sea coast was nearly within the coalition's grasp. Inside Sevastopol, however, a young Russian officer held a different view. He meticulously documented the wartime scenes he witnessed through writing. At the onset of the siege, the city lacked both sturdy fortifications and sufficient troop deployments militarily. There seemed no hope of holding out. Yet the soldiers and civilians in the city firmly believed they could repel the enemy's attack. They faced life-threatening dangers 100 times greater than ordinary people, while enduring the torment of insomnia, harsh sanitary conditions, and endless labor. Even so, they were willing to endure such hardships not for crosses of St. George or other honors, but out of a noble motive, a deep love for their homeland. This recorder was the Russian officer Leo Tolstoy. Looking back to April 10, 1846, inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, an unexpected clash erupted between a group of Eastern Orthodox believers and a group of Catholics. The verbal dispute quickly escalated into violent brawling. By the time Ottoman soldiers arrived to regain control, over 40 bodies lay at the scene. As a holy city of three religions revered by Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, Jerusalem had witnessed countless wars and bloodshed over more than 2 millennia. This Easter bloodshed was merely a minor episode in its long history. No one at the time, however, anticipated that such a limited-scale religious conflict would become the trigger for a devastating war that would plunge continental Europe into upheaval: the Crimean War. Since the 19th century, with the popularization of railway and steamship technology, the number of European Christians making pilgrimages to Jerusalem had increased significantly, and the religious influence of European countries had also expanded into the region. Among them, the Eastern Orthodox Church, led by the Russian Empire, held the strongest sway. As a core stronghold of European conservatism, Russia's religious fervor far surpassed that of other European nations, largely because Eastern Orthodoxy had not undergone the ideological shocks of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment, unlike Catholicism. It was this cultural and religious divide that set Russia on a fundamentally different path of development from Western European countries. In 1453, the Eastern Roman Empire Byzantine Empire fell, and Moscow replaced Constantinople as the new center of Eastern Orthodoxy, historically known as the Third Rome. Based on this belief, the Russian Empire put forward the concept of Holy Russia, which transcended geographical boundaries and advocated for the establishment of a universal empire centered on Eastern Orthodoxy. Theoretically, all Eastern Orthodox believers were regarded as subjects of the Russian Empire who had not yet been incorporated into its territory. Notably, the main settlements of Eastern Orthodox believers happened to lie within the Ottoman Empire, south of Russia. Before the outbreak of the Crimean War, Russia and the Ottoman Empire had already fought 8 large-scale wars known as the Russo-Turkish Wars. The most influential among these was the 6th Russo-Turkish War during the reign of Catherine the Great. 3 renowned Russian generals, Alexander Suvorov, Pyotr Rumyantsev, and Mikhail Kutuzov, fought in coordination, successfully capturing the Crimean Peninsula and the port of Sevastopol. This ice-free port on the Black Sea held extraordinary significance for Russia's national strategy. Russia's northern port of St. Petersburg was ice-locked and impassable for half the year, and vulnerable to blockades by other countries. Sevastopol, by contrast, became Russia's crucial ticket to global hegemony. But Russia's ambitions at the time extended far beyond this. In the early 19th century, during the Napoleonic Wars that determined Europe's fate, Russia, relying on Moscow's harsh winter and a million-strong serf army, completely defeated Napoleon's forces. It then marched westward to Paris, reaching the banks of the Seine, earning the title of the Gendarme of Europe. In stark contrast, the Ottoman Empire during the same period had declined into the sick man of the Near East, with its national strength fading and its rule teetering. All major European powers clearly recognized that the Ottoman Empire's collapse was inevitable. The only dispute was over how to divide its territories and spheres of influence. On June 1, 1844, Tsar Nicholas I paid a secret visit to Britain, meeting with Queen Victoria and Prime Minister Robert Peel. Nicholas I directly stated his request: Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, is a dying body. Britain and Russia should work together to formulate a territorial division plan to avoid large-scale war in Europe. He also claimed, "I have no extra ambition for an inch of Turkish territory. This is solely to safeguard Europe's permanent peace." Finally, he emphasized, as long as Britain and Russia reach an agreement, the attitudes of other European countries do not matter. Nicholas I was confident in this proposal for two reasons. First, Russia had previously helped Britain defeat Napoleon, its arch-nemesis. Second, the economic ties between the two countries were extremely close. Britain accounted for 73% of Russia's total exports, and Russia accounted for 41% of Britain's total exports. This special relationship led the Tsar to believe that British-Russian friendship was unbreakable, so much so that the meeting only produced an unsigned secret memorandum, not a formal diplomatic document. However, the British government's stance was far from what Nicholas I expected. Victorian Britain had developed into the empire on which the sun never sets, with a territory of 33 million square kilometers, a population of 400 million, and industrial output accounting for 1/3 of the world's total. Yet, its expansion model was fundamentally different from Russia's. Britain pursued free trade imperialism, restricting the sovereignty of other countries through military deterrence and political intervention, and building its imperial system through economic colonization rather than direct territorial rule. In 1838, Britain forced the Ottoman Empire to sign a tariff agreement through military pressure, turning Istanbul into a fully open free trade port. Deprived of tariff protection, the Ottoman Empire's domestic industry could not compete with the industrial goods of Western powers. Britain's exports to the Ottoman Empire increased 11-fold over a decade, and the Ottoman market became Britain's most promising new market. Therefore, a corrupt but still ruling Ottoman government best served Britain's economic interests. If the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Britain would lose a stable partner for treaty signing and a market for exporting goods. At the same time, Russia's expansion in Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, and Central Asia touched Britain's core interest, India. Known as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, India's GDP once accounted for 40% of Britain's total. Historically, when Napoleon merely expressed intent to attack India from the direction of Egypt, it triggered panic selling on the London Stock Exchange. If Russia successfully captured Istanbul, its Black Sea fleet could sail directly into the Mediterranean, seriously threatening the maritime lifeline between Britain's mainland and India. Based on this, the British government made containing Russian influence within the Black Sea a long-term national policy, with any short-term interests subordinated to this goal. Maintaining the existence of the Ottoman Empire was the best buffer zone against Russian expansion. To this end, Britain provided the Ottoman Empire with technical and financial support to assist its modernization reforms. The key figure in promoting Ottoman reforms was Stratford Canning, the British ambassador to Istanbul who had a close personal relationship with Ottoman Sultan Abdülmecid I. Under Canning's impetus, the Ottoman Empire launched the famous Tanzimat reforms, or reforms of benevolence, aiming to build a modern industrial system and a new style army. However, the Ottoman Empire's core problem lay in its intricate internal conflicts. Religious, ethnic, and class contradictions were intertwined, and its ruling foundation was like a precarious building teetering in the wind, barely sustained by historical inertia. The modernization reforms attempted to restructure the country's foundation without touching its ruling framework, an essentially impossible task. In the end, the Tanzimat reforms not only failed to save the Ottoman Empire but also accelerated the collapse of its ruling system. The British government watched with anxiety, especially after Nicholas I proposed the division plan, realizing that time was running out. Even so, in the diplomatic context of the time, a complete rupture between Britain and Russia was still seen as impossible. Their economic ties were too tight. At this critical juncture, a third force Emperor Napoleon III of the Second French Empire stepped in at the right moment. After the outbreak of the French February Revolution in 1848, Napoleon III was elected president of the French Second Republic by a landslide. 4 years later, he seized power and crowned himself emperor. As a typical representative of Bonapartism, Napoleon III's policy strategy aimed to balance the interests of all parties to gain support, and the largest group of voters in France at the time was Catholic farmers. To this end, Napoleon III took a series of measures to curry favor with Catholics, establishing church schools, escorting the Pope back to the Vatican, and most importantly, competing for the protectorship of the holy sites in Jerusalem. Although France at this time had undergone the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, and its religious atmosphere was far less fanatical than Russia's, the issue of the holy sites carried both religious and national significance. Historically, France had been the main force in the Crusades, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem was established by French nobles. Therefore, regaining the protectorate of the holy sites could both satisfy Catholics' religious sentiments and stir up French nationalist fervor, a win-win move. France immediately took action. In May 1852, it dispatched 2 steam battleships, the Charlemagne and the Napoleon, to break through the Dardanelles, aiming their artillery at the city of Istanbul. Faced with this tough gunboat diplomacy, Sultan Abdülmecid I, after ineffective protests, was forced to hand over the key to the management of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This outcome greatly dissatisfied Russia. In February 1853, Nicholas I deployed 140,000 troops along the Russo-Turkish border, then sent 65-year-old Admiral Alexander Menshikov to Istanbul ostensibly for negotiations, but in reality, to deliver an ultimatum. Menshikov put forward 3 demands to the Ottoman Empire. First, revoke the previous religious decree favoring Catholics. Second, restore the exclusive privileges of the Eastern Orthodox Church over the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Third, all Eastern Orthodox believers within the Ottoman Empire would be protected by Russia. The top echelons of the Ottoman Empire were shocked upon hearing this. The first 2 demands fell within the scope of religious disputes, but the third was equivalent to recognizing that the European territories of the Ottoman Empire were part of Russia's sphere of influence. It was not just a treasonous clause, but a national surrender treaty. The Ottoman Empire dared not sign such a treaty, yet lacked the strength to go to war with Russia. It could only implore Menshikov to make concessions while urgently notifying Britain and France to seek support. Menshikov, however, adopted an extremely tough stance, clearly stating, either accept or go to war, no room for compromise. When the news reached London, the British government was thrown into chaos. All parties knew the crisis would erupt sooner or later, but they all hoped it would be delayed until the next cabinet term, so no emergency plan had been formulated. The Prime Minister, Earl of Aberdeen, urgently appointed Ambassador Canning to mediate, urging Russia and Turkey to exercise restraint and resolve this eastern crisis through peaceful dialogue. But when the same news reached Paris, Napoleon III secretly rejoiced. He had initially promoted the holy sites issue only to please domestic public opinion, never expecting to gain an unexpected diplomatic opportunity. This opportunity arose against the backdrop of France's diplomatic predicament at the time. After the Napoleonic Wars, France had alienated most European countries due to repeated external expansions. Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia formed the Holy Alliance, whose core goal was to contain France. To break this diplomatic encirclement, Napoleon III had made multiple attempts to curry favor with Britain, but was met with coldness due to the special British-Russian relationship. Now, the Holy Sites issue not only exposed Russia's ambition to expand westward but also completely publicized the contradictions between Britain and Russia, an unprecedented opportunity for France. For this reason, Napoleon III promised the Ottoman ambassador, "Rest assured, Your Highness the Sultan, France will firmly stand on the side of upholding international justice to support your country." On March 22, 1853, the French fleet set sail from the port of Toulon, heading once again for the Dardanelles, this time to provide military support to the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, Ambassador Canning's mediation efforts in Istanbul made little progress. He proposed that Russia and Turkey set aside sovereignty disputes and negotiate only on religious issues, but this was rejected by both sides. The Ottoman Empire, emboldened by France's secret commitment, adopted a tough stance. Russia, for its part, had long used the religious issue as a pretext, with its real goal being to expand its sphere of influence. On May 15th, the negotiations collapsed completely, and Menshikov, on behalf of Russia, announced the formal severance of diplomatic relations with the Ottoman Empire. On July 3rd, Russian troops crossed the border and captured the 2 Danubian principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia, now part of Romania under Ottoman control. War seemed imminent, but one person still tried to save the peace: Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria. As a traditional ally of Russia, Austria was grateful to Russia. During the 1848 European revolutions, the Habsburg dynasty's rule was nearly overthrown, and it was Russia's dispatch of troops to suppress the Hungarian Revolution that helped the Austrian emperor stabilize his regime. In 1850, Russia stood up for Austria again, forcing Prussia to dissolve the Erfurt Union and helping Austria maintain its influence in the German-speaking regions. Logically, Austria should have sided with Russia, but practical interests made it hesitate repeatedly. Austria also had a large number of Eastern Orthodox believers within its borders. If it stood by and allowed Russia to expand its influence under the banner of Eastern Orthodoxy, Austria might eventually suffer the same fate as the Ottoman Empire. More importantly, Austria's foreign trade relied heavily on Danube shipping. After Russia captured the Danubian principalities and took control of the Danube estuary, the impact on Austria's economy was far greater than on Britain. Therefore, after the crisis broke out, Austria remained a mediator, taking the lead in convening the Vienna Conference to seek a balance between urging Russia to withdraw its troops and safeguarding Nicholas I's dignity. On July 28th, the foreign ministers of Britain, France, and Austria drafted the Vienna Note for the Ottoman Empire, revising the third demand from the previous negotiations to the Ottoman Empire commits to safeguarding the special rights of Eastern Orthodox believers within its borders and accepts supervision from Russia, faced with pressure from Britain, France, and Austria, and with its ally Austria adopting an ambiguous attitude. Nicholas I had to make concessions, agreeing to accept this plan and inviting Ottoman representatives to sign the agreement. But a dramatic turn of events soon followed. The Ottoman representatives stated that they had no objection to the Vienna Note itself, but demanded that Russia first withdraw its troops from the Danubian principalities, and Britain, France, and Austria must guarantee that Russia will not invade again. When Nicholas I learned of this demand, he flew into a rage, firmly believing that Britain and France had deliberately used the peace talks to humiliate Russia without external support. The Ottoman Empire would never have dared to make such a request with its own strength. In reality, however, this demand may have had nothing to do with Britain and France. At the time, a large-scale nationalist movement broke out in Istanbul, and 35 religious leaders jointly submitted an ultimatum to the Sultan, demanding that he either declare a holy war against Russia or abdicate. On October 4th, the Ottoman Empire issued an official statement demanding that Russia withdraw its troops from the Danubian principalities within 15 days, otherwise it would fight to defend national sovereignty. This statement also triggered a nationalist backlash in Russia. The pan-Slavist leader Mikhail Pogodin submitted a memorial to the Tsar, writing, "France seized Algeria from the Ottoman Empire, and Britain annexes a principality in India every year. These actions have never been regarded as disrupting the European balance of power. Yet Russia only temporarily occupies Moldavia and Wallachia, and is slandered as the destroyer of European peace. We can never gain any goodwill from these Western countries. They do not understand us, and we have no intention of understanding them." Nicholas I annotated next to this passage. This is the core crux. On October 16th, Russia formally declared war on the Ottoman Empire, and the Crimean War broke out in full. In the first month of the war, both Russia and Turkey exercised a certain degree of restraint. Russia still hoped that the Ottoman Empire would back down, while the Ottoman Empire waited for reinforcements from Britain and France. By the end of October, the combined British-French fleet arrived in Istanbul. Emboldened by this strong support, the Ottoman Navy believed Russia would certainly be deterred and began active patrols in the Black Sea. On November 27th, an Ottoman fleet sailed into the port of Sinop on the coast of Anatolia to rest, but unexpectedly encountered the Russian Black Sea Fleet commanded by Vice Admiral Pavel Nakhimov, who had previously made a name for himself in the Battle of Sinop. On November 30th, the Battle of Sinop began. The Russian ships deployed newly developed explosive shells, which could pierce the hull directly and blow the ships apart from the inside. Within a few hours, the Black Sea Fleet achieved a complete victory. It sank 7 Ottoman frigates and 2 light cruisers, and completely destroyed all artillery batteries in the port of Sinop. On December 11th, news of the Battle of Sinop reached London, and the Aberdeen cabinet could no longer pretend to ignore this eastern crisis. At the time, the British public had shown limited concern about Russia's military. On December 11th, news of the Battle of Sinop reached London, and the Aberdeen cabinet could no longer pretend to ignore this eastern crisis. At that time, the British public showed limited concern about Russia's military operations in the Danube Basin. However, if the conflict involved maritime interests, it would immediately trigger their sensitive and fragile nerves. On the same day, the Times published an editorial stating, "The Battle of Sinop has completely dispelled our desire to quell the war. The Emperor of Russia has, in fact, formally declared war on the British Navy, and we have no choice but to acknowledge that war has already begun." France, for its part, had long been ready to join the war. On December 19th, Napoleon III recalled the British ambassador to France and clearly proposed that the combined British-French fleet must sail into the Black Sea to force the Russian Navy to withdraw to its homeland. If Britain refused to assume its international responsibilities, the French fleet would act alone. On December 22nd, the British government finally agreed to Napoleon III's proposal. In January of the following year, the combined British-French fleet entered the Black Sea to provide escort for the Ottoman Empire's fleet. On February 16th, Nicholas I announced the severance of diplomatic relations with both Britain and France simultaneously, and issued a warning to the tough-talking Napoleon III, "Do not forget what happened in 1812. Instead of being alarmed. Napoleon III was overjoyed. He ordered domestic newspapers to publish the Tsar's threat in its original form. This move immediately triggered a strong response in French society. The left wing had always regarded the Russian government, which suppressed revolutions, as a mortal enemy, while the right wing still harbored deep resentment over the disastrous defeat in the 1812 Battle of Moscow. From this point on, the two factions firmly united under Napoleon III's banner. On March 27th, France took the lead in declaring war on Russia. The next day, Britain also formally entered the war. By then, the three most powerful powers in the world had successively been drawn into the conflict, and this Eastern crisis thus escalated into a war of pan-European scale. After the war broke out, Nicholas I was well aware that the Russian Navy could hardly compete with the British-French Navy. Yet he had full confidence in his own army. The Russian army at that time had a strength of 1 million soldiers and was known as the #1 army in Europe. To this end, the top command of the Russian army formulated a strategy to launch a blitz attack after the spring and capture Istanbul before the full intervention of the British-French coalition. The Slavic faction regarded this as a crucial step in the revival of the Orthodox Empire. They even proposed the name Tsargrad for this envisioned new imperial capital. However, Nicholas I's ambition ignored a core reality. The global model of land warfare had undergone a fundamental transformation. The main force of the Russian army was composed of serfs. These soldiers were apathetic yet loyal, ignorant yet brave, and illiterate yet willing to obey orders unconditionally. In the era dominated by linear tactics, such soldiers were considered high-quality recruits at that time. The core requirement for soldiers was only to maintain formation and charge into battle. However, the emergence of rifled weapons completely ended the era of linear tactics, and the Russian serf army, which had once held a tactical advantage, was reduced to cannon fodder on the battlefield in the new era. All this transformation stemmed merely from a single iteration of military technology. Another fatal problem lay in Russia's vast territory. In the absence of railway transportation, it took months to deploy troops to the border, which would inevitably impact agricultural production. Therefore, the Russian aristocracy tended to send elderly, weak, sick, and disabled soldiers to the front line. A military report in 1848 showed that approximately one-third of Russian conscripts failed to meet the height requirement for enlistment, and another half were unfit for service due to other physical defects. This was also the core reason why the Russian army was more capable of fighting on its home soil than abroad. To solve the problems of troop quality and transportation efficiency, a universal conscription system was needed, but this reform would first require the abolition of serfdom, and serfdom was the foundational pillar of the Russian Empire, an untouchable institutional red line. In the end, more than 100,000 Russian soldiers crossed the Danube River with numerous hidden risks, marching confidently toward Istanbul, only to encounter the Waterloo of their military campaign at the Silistra fortress. On March 20, 1854, the Russian army besieged the Silistra fortress at the mouth of the Danube River. The Ottoman garrison defending the fortress had only 18,000 soldiers, but they had undergone training as part of modernization reforms and held a strong enthusiasm driven by religious beliefs. Two British military attaches in the Ottoman army documented the bravery of the defending soldiers in writing in the early stages of the war. The Russian army concentrated a large number of artillery pieces to launch a fierce bombardment on the fortress, and even deployed naval guns for support. Whenever the Russian artillery blew a gap in the fortifications, dozens of Ottoman engineers would immediately charge forward to repair it, one after another, as if they were merely mending an ordinary trench. Relying on their indomitable will, the defenders held their ground until the end of May. The Russian army, eager to capture the fortress, then launched a full-scale assault. The Ottoman defenders fought more fiercely as the battle progressed, with morale far exceeding conventional expectations. They repelled 20 large-scale Russian charges in a row and even launched a counterattack against the Russian positions at one point. The defense of Silistra ultimately bought valuable time for the Ottoman Empire to secure international assistance. In mid-June, Austria assembled 200,000 troops and deployed them on the Austro-Russian border, demanding that the Russian army withdraw from the Danube basin. This threat proved highly effective. Nicholas I clearly remembered the lesson of Napoleon's disastrous defeat after ignoring Metternich's advice. However, he also expressed strong anger toward Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria. He sent a portrait of the Austrian emperor back to Vienna, with an inscription in German on the back, "Thou art an ungrateful wretch." Undoubtedly, Austria's stance in the Crimean War was an overt betrayal of Russia, and Austria did indeed pay a price for it later. Yet it is also unfair to unilaterally blame Austria for this. As a traditional ally of Russia, Russia had not notified Austria at all before sending troops to the Danube, putting Austria in an extremely passive diplomatic position. Austria also had core interests in the Balkans and could not make unlimited concessions to Russia. After the incident, Austria did not break off relations with Russia immediately. Instead, it continued to mediate between the parties, attempting to maintain the existence of the Holy Alliance. Even after Russia crossed the Danube and ignored warnings from Vienna, Austria still did not resort to military conflict with Russia. It merely acquiesced to the Russian withdrawal and convened all parties to launch a new round of negotiations. While condemning Austria for betrayal, Nicholas I might have also reflected, did he truly treat Austria as an equal ally? By the end of July 1854, the Russian army had completely withdrawn from the Danube basin. Theoretically, the war should have ended at this point, but Britain explicitly opposed this. British troops had been deployed over a long distance, and the military budget had already been approved. If no substantive combat operations were carried out, it would be difficult to account to the domestic public and Parliament. Among the voices advocating for continued war, the proposal from Graham, the British First Lord of the Admiralty, to the cabinet was the most representative. He wrote in his letter, "The fangs of the Russian bear must be uprooted entirely. Until the Russian Black Sea Fleet is completely destroyed, the security of Istanbul cannot be guaranteed, nor can peace in Europe be stabilized." In contrast, France's enthusiasm for the war cooled down at this time. Napoleon III had already achieved all his strategic goals at the outbreak of the war. The deterioration of British-Russian relations and the breakdown of Russian-Austrian relations had brought France an unprecedentedly favorable diplomatic situation. In the end, it was again Austria that mediated between the parties and brought Britain and France back to the negotiating table. On August 8, Britain, France, and Austria put forward 4 solutions to Russia once again. 1. Russia abandons its territorial claims against the Ottoman Empire. 2. The entire Danube River is open to commercial navigation for all countries. 3. Russia's dominant position in the Black Sea Navy is terminated. 4. Russia gives up its right to protect Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire. This proposal was already the bottom line acceptable to Britain and France, but Nicholas I explicitly rejected it. He was determined to continue the war to secure a fair and dignified peace agreement that was commensurate with Russia's status. On September 7, 400 warships carrying 60,000 soldiers of the British-French coalition set sail in a grand formation, with their target directly pointing to the Crimean Peninsula. On September 14, 1854, the coalition landed on the western part of the Crimean Peninsula, then marched southward toward the port of Sevastopol. At that time, the commander of the Russian Southern Front was none other than Menshikov, who had previously gone to Istanbul for negotiations. He had never expected the coalition to launch an attack as winter approached and thus failed to complete the mobilization of his troops in a timely manner. Even so, Menshikov was still full of confidence in the upcoming battle. He deployed his troops on the highlands along the Alma River, planning to block the coalition by relying on the favorable terrain. In a letter to the Tsar, he vowed with assurance the Russian army can hold its position for at least 6 weeks. By then, the severe winter will deal another heavy blow to the coalition, just as the Russian army defeated Napoleon's Grand Army with the help of the winter in 1812. On September 20th, the Battle of the Alma River officially began. The first round of Russian artillery fire caused almost no effective casualties, simply because the British army, attacking head-on, formed 2 horizontal lines, which looked like a thin red thread from a distance. Although this formation was conducive to dispersing the enemy's firepower targets, it was difficult to resist the enemy's charge. Yet the core advantage of the British formation lay in the Mini rifles it was equipped with. As the first rifled rifle put into actual combat, the Mini rifle had an almost dimension-reducing strike advantage over the Russian smoothbore muskets. As a Russian soldier recorded in his memoirs, "When the enemy was 300 paces away from us, our smoothbore muskets could no longer hit them. Yet the enemy could fire at us from 1,200 paces away. Every time we launched a charge, the enemy would take a step back and then open fire with precise aim. The range of the Mini rifle even suppressed the firepower of the Russian artillery at one point." The Russian artillery positions on the highlands, which had no trench protection, were directly destroyed by several rounds of British gunfire, leaving Russian soldiers unable to even determine the direction from which the bullets were coming. When the British army broke through the Russian defense line from the front, the French Foreign Legion, supported by naval artillery, successfully captured the telegraph hill on the left wing of the Russian army, forming an encirclement of the Russian troops. Panic spread rapidly, and by PM, the Russian army was defeated across the board. Menshikov's pre-war vow collapsed after only a few hours. After the main force of the Russian army was defeated, only 5,000 defenders and 10,000 sailors remained in Sevastopol. If the coalition had pressed forward in pursuit of victory, it would have been entirely possible to capture the port directly. However, Raglan, the commander-in-chief of the coalition, hesitated and acted sluggishly, ultimately allowing the Sevastopol garrison to gain valuable time to prepare for defense. Nakhimov, who had completely annihilated the Ottoman fleet in the Battle of Sinop, took over the important task of defending the port of Sevastopol. He made a decisive decision to implement a ship-sinking tactic. Sailors personally scuttled their own warships, completely blocking the British-French coalition's sea route for attacking the port. Later, Nakhimov mobilized all military and civilian personnel in the city to build trenches and repair fortifications, striving to strengthen the fortress before the coalition launched its siege. In the eyes of the coalition, however, these efforts were nothing but death throw. The coalition had a significant firepower advantage, with a total of 126 heavy siege artillery pieces and 1,000 naval guns providing support from the sea. All artillery officers believed that after the bombardment, Sevastopol would inevitably be reduced to a pile of rubble. In the early morning of October 17th, as soon as the thick fog lifted, the coalition launched a fierce fire attack on Sevastopol. The entire city was immediately shrouded in dense black smoke, darkening the sky to such an extent that the coalition artillery could not even aim accurately. Near noon, the coalition fleet also joined the bombardment sequence, launching an attack on Sevastopol from outside the port. Facts proved that the Russian army's ship-sinking tactic was highly effective. The coalition warships could not sail to an effective bombardment distance, and instead were exposed to the fire coverage of the Russian hidden artillery. In the end, the coalition fleet fired a total of 50,000 shells, but failed to cause any substantial damage to the Russian defenses. On the contrary, 5 coalition warships were severely damaged by the Russian hidden artillery, with 500 casualties. At the height of the artillery battle, a Russian shell accurately hit the French arsenal, immediately paralyzing all French artillery. The British bombardment was equally ineffective when shells hit the earthen fortifications built by the Russian army. The effect was like hitting a pudding. A British artillery commander wrote in his diary, "The damage our artillery inflicted on the enemy is not even comparable to the wear and tear on our own gun barrels." In the evening, the smoke cleared, and Sevastopol miraculously survived. A loud cheer erupted in the city as if overnight the enemy's invincible myth had been shattered, and the Russian officers and soldiers rekindled their hope and fighting spirit. Among the cheering crowd, Leo Tolstoy, then 26 years old, witnessed this moment. Later, he wrote about this experience in his famous work, The Sevastopol Sketches. The book states, "You walk along the road you came from, toward the battlefield that has been reduced to ruins. Cannonballs and bullets whistle past you, but you pay no attention. Instead, your heart is filled with calm joy. What you bring back from the defense line is the most important and comforting belief: Sevastopol will never be conquered by the enemy." This article concludes its review of the early stages of the Crimean War. In subsequent content, we will further elaborate on the final outcome of the Crimean War and the ultimate fate of Sevastopol, analyze how this war shaped the sense of community of the Russian nation, and how it profoundly reshaped the world pattern of the 19th century.